Hello, everybody, and welcome to another digital service for Encounter Church. If this is your first time tuning in, my name is Joel. I'm the lead pastor of Encounter, and we're really glad that you're joining us. Last Sunday, if you notice, we took a week off. We didn't have an online service. The reason for that was because we were celebrating our 40-year anniversary. So we had a special in-person service at our office location. It was great. I think that some of you that tune online were there for that, and we're really glad that you were able to worship with us last Sunday. But this Sunday, we're back to normal. We're back meeting at 5 p.m. at Park Road Community Church in Columbia Heights. And, we'd love to see you sometime at one of those services. But we're also back with our digital service that we do. So everything is moving back to normal. And we're actually starting a new series. And we're calling it Renaissance. And, if you're familiar with your history, Renaissance is this period in Europe in particular, after the Middle Ages, that's characterized by this kind of like flourishing and renewal of arts and culture, science. Like it's kind of like this rediscovery of the Greek tradition, and that kind of like it's a period that leads Europe into, and honestly, the world into modernity. And the question I'm trying to explore with this series is, could it be that, as a society, but particularly Christianity and the church, and honestly our church, if we could be stepping into a period of Renaissance? We've gone through this terrible crisis. I'm tired of talking about all the things that have happened in the 6 months, as I'm sure you are. But, in the aftermath of all that, we could very easily look at the future with dread and fear and trepidation and things, and think that things are just going to keep getting progressively worse. But what if that's not the only option? What if there's a possibility actually that everything that's happened is kind of like prepping us and opening the doors for a good future, for a time of flourishing and change? And I'm not saying this just kind of like as being ever the optimist, but actually because I believe in that. I believe in that because I've seen it, all throughout the scriptures, but also because we've seen it through history. The Renaissance period, one of the things that kind of like leads into that is a global pandemic. Like when I was researching for this, I was surprised to learn that, the deadliest pandemic we've seen is not COVID-19, is not the Spanish flu of 1918, it's the Black Death. The Black Death is this, pandemic affects mostly Africa and Europe in the 1300s. We have different records as far as like the numbers, but it's anywhere between 75 to 200 million people that died during that. It's killed like half Europe. And the ironic and sad thing is that, the Black Death is not the only bad thing that's happening in Europe at the time. That actually, when you look at it historically, it's the culmination of this period called the crisis of the late Middle Ages. And we call it the crisis of the late Middle Ages because it's like bad thing after bad thing after bad thing. There's this famine that kills like 10% of the European population, that kind of like kickstarts things, that leads to a number of wars that break out all over Europe, which then there's this schism in the Catholic Church, and then the Black Death comes. And anybody looking at that would tell you, well, Europe is headed to a collapse. It's just going to disintegrate and go away because of all of these terrible things are happening one after the other. And yet that's not what happens. What happens is that the aftermath of that, starting in Florence, we enter into this period of rebirth and renewal and flourishing in arts and culture and science and all sorts of things of life that eventually leads into modernity. And honestly, if you look at history, that's not the only time that happens. Like throughout history, usually these moments of deep, profound crisis lead into some sort of change, and a lot of times those changes are, marked by these periods of renewal and flourishing. Matter of fact, in the history of the church, that's the case. Like if you look through history and you look at the great revivals that have broken out, these moments when God has moved and people in an even more supernatural way just very easily turn to Christ, and God like changes, cities and regions with his power. Most of those revivals usually come on the end of times of dryness and difficulty where people think that things are going to die. It's usually stories of, the church was dying and there was like these 2-3 people in a basement praying, crying out to God, and then God moved and did something. And what I've been wondering in the last few months is, could that be us? Could that be as a society, but particularly could that be as the church? What if everything that's happened, that somehow God in His mercy and grace can use that and lead us into a different time, and lead us into a time of renewal, and lead us into a time of flourishing, and lead us into a time of change that brings people to Christ. And right now, looking at the news, might not look like that. And looking at how people think about Christianity, might not look like that. But what if we could be on the verge of that? And I'll tell you this, one of the reasons why I believe this is because this is actually a pattern that you see not only throughout history, but particularly in the scriptures of how God moves in the world. And there's example after example in the Bible that perhaps the best example of that is, the history of the exile and then the return of the people of Israel to the promised land. And you're familiar with the story at all. After the people of Israel settle into the land of Canaan, then becomes the nation of Israel. They experience many years of just being in the land and being a nation. They become two nations, but they occupy that land for many years until eventually the Babylonian Empire comes and destroys Jerusalem, razes to the ground, and then takes the people of Israel into exile. And this is not something that kind of like comes out of nowhere. The people of Israel know about this because God has been sending them prophet after prophet after prophet, telling them that because they've strayed away from God, because they've abandoned God, that God was going to kind of like withdraw His protection over them, and then this empire was coming and He was going to come after them, and it's God kind of like begging them to repent and to turn back to Him so it wouldn't happen. And eventually it happened. Now the interesting thing is that if you read all those prophecies, most of the time you're going to read these prophecies of like, this judgment is coming, the Babylonians are coming, the Assyrians are coming, these bad things are going to happen, and right next to those prophecies you always find a different type of prophecy. And it's usually a prophecy of hope. It's a prophecy God saying, like, this bad thing is going to happen. You're going to go into exile, but your exile is not going to last forever. You're not always going to be away from your homeland. I am going to bring you back. I'm going to gather you from wherever you are. And I'm going to bring a remnant back to Jerusalem. And in every single prophecy that you see of God telling them that there's this exile coming, you're also going to see a promise of return. I want to read one to you today. It's one of my favorite ones that kind of like encapsulates this idea. This is in the book of Ezekiel. It's the prophet Ezekiel talking, and this is Ezekiel chapter 37. Let's start reading on verse 1. It says, "The hand of the Lord was on me, and He brought me out by the Spirit of the Lord and set me in the middle of a valley. It was full of bones. He led me back and forth among them, and I saw great many bones on the floor of the valley, bones that were very dry. He asked me, 'Son of man, can these bones live?' I said, 'Sovereign Lord, you alone know.' Then He said to me, 'Prophesy to these bones and say to them, dry bones, hear the word of the Lord. This is what the Sovereign Lord says to these bones. I will make breath enter you, and you will come to life. I will attach tendons to you and make flesh come upon you and cover you with skin. I will put breath in you and you will come to life. Then you will know that I am the Lord.' So I prophesied as I was commanded, and as I was prophesying, there was a noise, a rattling sound, and the bones came together, bone to bone. I looked, and tendons and flesh appeared in them, and skin covered them, but there was no breath in them. Then He said to me, 'Prophesy to the breath, prophesy, Son of man,' and said to it, 'This is what the Sovereign Lord says. Come, breath from the four winds, and breathe into this slain that they may live.' So I prophesied as he commanded me. In breath entered them. They came to life and stood up on their feet, a vast army. Then he said to me, Son of man, these bones are the people of Israel. They say, our bones are dried up and our hope is gone. We are cut off. Therefore prophesy and say to them, this is what the sovereign Lord says, my people, I am going to open your graves and bring you up from them. I will bring you back to the land of Israel. Then you, my people, will know that I am the Lord. When I open your graves and bring you up from them, I will put my spirit in you and you will live, and I will settle you in your own land. Then you will know that I, the Lord, have spoken and I have done it, declares the Lord. This prophecy, that Ezekiel is speaking into, and it's interesting because there's this tension in the prophecy, right? Like you see this image of these dry bones, and if you understand what this means, basically like it's death beyond death, right? Like it's only that the person is dead and the corpse is there, but there's no life in it. No, the corpse is disintegrated, and all that's left is the bones. Basically, death beyond any hope of anything. And actually, he makes that point in the passage, because the people of Israel speak in the passage. God kind of like makes them speak, and he says, our bones are dried up and our hope is gone. We are cut off. What he's saying is like, things have gotten as bad as they could get. Right? The people of Israel are going to go into exile. They're going to be separated from everything. They're going to be there for 70 years. And they're like, things are bad. And I look at that story and I think it's not that dissimilar from how we find ourselves in right now. Like, again, don't want to recap everything bad that has happened in the last 6 months, but we know everything that's happened. And a lot of times I look at the news and it doesn't seem like things are getting any better. Like, it actually feels like things are getting worse. And it's easy to believe in those circumstances, well, what if things are just going to keep getting worse, like progressively worse and worse and worse and worse, until everything collapses? I think about Christianity, and you've heard me preach on this before. After everything that's happened in the last few years, after all the preposterous, ridiculous things that some Christian leaders have said, after how Christians have behaved on social media, after the exposure of the, sins of prominent Christian leaders, after all of that, I don't blame anybody if they don't ever want to step a foot into a church again. Anybody. But as a pastor who loves people and who believes that Jesus is the hope of the world, and who believes that Jesus longs to be with people, and that kind of like compels them to come to him, well, that presents a problem, because it makes me worry, like, well, what's going to happen? Because people still need Jesus, right? As a church ourselves, like we've talked about this, if you were at our anniversary service, we're at this moment of crossroads that we are, meeting back in person. We really need to, rebuild our volunteer base and, start like bringing all this, our ministries back to life. And sometimes it looks like, can we actually pull this off? Can we do this? Because it doesn't feel like sometimes like we can. Do you see, like, it's very easy at this moment to look at how things are and think that everything is just going to go down bad and collapse. And yet, in this story, God presents the people of Israel a different alternative, a different future, a different possibility. And it's the possibility of new life, He's like, your hopes, your dreams are like these bones that are dried, right? Like, you think that the only future for your people right now is no future, that the Jewish way of life is going to disappear. You're going to die. And in the prophecy, that's not what happens, but God starts breathing life back into the dead hopes and dreams of the people of Israel, until they're able to stand up. And if you're familiar with the history, eventually the people of Israel come back from exile into their land. And that almost becomes like this pattern for them that you see throughout the scriptures, that in the midst of the most difficult time, of the hardest time, that there always hope that God can do something. And what I've been wondering is, could that be the case for us? Could that be the case for society? And honestly, there is a reason why moments of crisis and difficulty are followed by moments sometimes of cultural flourishing and renewal. One of the things that happens is that these moments they help us change our way of thinking or a way of doing things in a way that then all of a sudden opens up all sorts of possibilities that before we just couldn't see. And just a couple examples, right? Think about how the pandemic has transformed the nature of work, right? That when before virtual work or teleworking was something that only a few people could do, now we've kind of proved almost everybody can do it. And you might hate it. I'm not saying it's an ideal thing, because sometimes we need to be with other people and want to be, in a place where there's no kids running around. I get that. But the point is that also in this thing that some people did, we had the technology to do it, but we just couldn't accept the paradigm. Also, it completely changed everything, and now everybody teleworks, and that is changing how companies think about staffing, because now you technically have access to people working anywhere living anywhere in the world. It changes how we think about buildings, because now you don't need this huge space to house a bunch of employees. It changes also, for example, what the role of cities and suburbs and places to live are, because before, many people wanted to live in a city because they needed the access to big companies and places of work. Now they can live maybe in more affordable places because they don't have to be at work all the time. All sorts of things change because of that. Another example, the technology that helped us develop the vaccines against COVID, the mRNA technology, there's a huge breakthrough in how we think about medicine. And I was just reading an article earlier this week about how they're beginning the first human trials for mRNA cancer treatments, and which might mean a completely revolutionized approach to how we treat cancer. In the midst of this terrible year, all these bad things have happened, there's also the seeds and the possibilities for really good things to happen. And I would argue that the same case is true in the church. That we're at this moment where, as I said, I don't blame anybody that doesn't ever want to be a Christian again, because of all the terrible things that were said and done in the name of Jesus in the last few years. At the same time, there's possibility for good change, because in a way, one of the things that this time has done is been kind of clarifying. For many pastors, one of the things that we realize is we've done a horrible job at just teaching people how to follow Jesus. So many of us thought that if we do this thing on Sunday mornings, I call it a concert and a TED Talk, right? Play a couple songs and preach a sermon and maybe try to get people to go to a small group, that was going to be enough to help people change. And what we're realizing it's not, because people are being informed 24/7 by cable news and the internet and all sorts of other things, and they've just done a bad job at helping people become better disciples of Jesus. But now that it's exposed, and because it's exposed, it's kind of forcing us to look at it and do something about it. It's this time has revolutionized, for better or worse, how we do church services, right? We're now having this conversation digitally. I know that there's people in other parts of the world that watch our services. I know there's people that, for a number of reasons can't come to our Sunday services. And now, before we wouldn't have done this because we didn't think we had the technology, we didn't think that we could afford it, we didn't think they had the time. And this time kind of forces into this. And all of a sudden opens new windows of how to connect with people. It creates all these possibilities for the future. What I want you to see there is that, the same moment that could spell our death, that could spell the death of a congregation, but also that could spell the death of large Christian movements as well. this moment could also be the key moment that God uses to change things and bring about a new thing that he wants to do, and bring about renewal, and bring about change, and bring about new life. And what if we have a choice to make of how we want to face the future, of how we want to step into tomorrow, of how we want to see the next day? And what I think is that in order for this renaissance to happen, one of the things that needs to happen is for all of us is clarifying and purifying and reframing of who we are, of what our priorities are, of what we want to do, of where we want to go. And I see that happen in people's lives, right? I see people that make, huge life decisions during the pandemic because all of a sudden you kind of like just shook all of their priorities, and they're like, why am I doing this with my life? Like, I don't want to do this. I have some friends that, they had this dream of like, starting like a bed and breakfast, and they just bought this big Victorian house and moved out to the country, and are like working on their dream. And it was like this like out of nowhere thing that this moment kind of like empowered them to like, well, just go for it. And I think that for us as a church, that's also gonna have to be true. That we're gonna have to look at, why are we doing what we're doing? What's the point of it? Where are we gonna go with it? And what I want to spend the next few weeks doing is actually exploring those questions. Like, what's the point of church? Why should we do this? Why should you care? What's the role that you could play in this? And that's kind of like the journey that we're gonna go in. And my hope is that on the other end of that journey, that God would speak to us together as a congregation and really start calling us and drawing us into the future that he has for us. But today, I just want to leave you with that question, right? The question that God asks Ezekiel: can these bones live? Because I think it's a question that God asks us as Encounter. Can these bones live? Can your all of the difficulty and the struggle and all of the challenges that we faced in the last 16 months, and some of us are tired and we feel like it's hard to keep going, and God is kind of like looking at us and asking us, do you think that I can do something with this beyond what you can? But I also think that's a question that maybe some of us need to ask of our own lives. Because for some of us, there's moments of, pain and difficulty. There's so many things that it feels like they're about to die. Maybe there's some things that feels like they've died, relationships, hopes, dreams, careers, like all sorts of things. And the question that I think that this passage asks of us is, what if there is life on the other end of whatever this death is, or whatever this difficulty is, whatever this struggle is? What if there's life on the other end of that? What if even if the relationship ended, and even if the job ended, even if the dream ended, or, even if you may feel like you're like an exile of sorts, and you don't know what's next, and you're kind of like just going through the motions because you can't imagine a future right now. What if even in the midst of that, there can be a future for you? Can these bones live? And the thing is that in Christianity, this idea is at the core of our faith, right? Like that death leads to new life. Like this is ultimately true in the resurrection of Jesus, that Jesus dies, and somehow in and through his death, there is now the power to defeat death, because he does it. because he defeats death, because he comes back, because he resurrects. And the resurrection of Jesus now has become the promise of our resurrection. But one of the things that you'll notice in the New Testament is that, for people that come after Jesus, the way that they thought about the resurrection of Jesus, it went beyond just this idea of, hey, one day when I die, I have the promise that I'm going to resurrect in the future that God is bringing. But it also became almost like the ultimate evidence of God's goodness and God's power. And what that meant is that then it also became the event that people could look to for hope. That there can always be a hope for new life because of the resurrection of Jesus. In the book of Romans, the Apostle Paul is talking about this, and he says, what then shall we say in response to these things? And he's talking about persecutions and difficulty and all sorts of things. And he says, if God is for us, who can be against us? He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also, along with him, graciously give us all things? And what Paul is saying is like, because Jesus died and resurrected, we can always have hope in God for everything else. Can these bones live? Can this thing that feels like it's completely dead? Maybe it's a relationship, maybe it's a dream, maybe it's your family life. Can this thing have new life in it? And sometimes the answer to that is yes, right? Like God can breathe new life into this thing that seems like it's all but dead, and God can renew it and change it, and there's hope and a future for us. But I actually think that the promise goes beyond that. Because I think that the promise is that even if the thing dies, there's a life on the other end of it. On the other end of my illness, or the death of a loved one, or whatever loss I experience, maybe the loss of a job, loss of a relationship, a divorce. That a lot of times we fear these things not only for the pain that they bring, but we fear these things because we cannot imagine a life beyond that. Can these bones live? What if there is a life beyond that? What if God can do something beyond that? What if even when we think that our life is over and that everything has fallen apart, what if God says there can still be a renaissance for you? There can still be rebirth and renewal and flourishing and hope for you. And the thing is that if that is true, well, then we can face anything with hope, right? And it's kind of like this different sort of confidence, like this dual hope that, okay, whatever the thing that is like I'm struggling with right now, and that it seems like it's going to fall apart, or I don't understand how that moves through, I can have hope that God can do something about that. If God brought Jesus back from the dead, God can do something about my job. If God brought Jesus back from the dead, God can do something about my relationship. If God brought Jesus back from the dead, then he can do something about my illness. I have the hope that whatever the thing that I'm looking at is, that God can intervene. But even if that doesn't work out the way I want it or I expect it to work out, even if I pray and I hope, and the thing still collapses and this thing still falls apart, well, my ultimate hope is that, even if this thing falls apart, I still have a future in God. That there can still be rebirth, there can still be renewal, that these bones can still live. That the death of that dream or that relationship or whatever, it's not the death of me. Because my life is now joined to Jesus' life forever. And I can have hope for today that God will still breathe life into me. What if we approach the next season as a church like that? and we just take the risk that God is calling us to take, and we dream the dreams guys, calling us to dream. And I'll tell you, I don't know what the future is like. I have no idea. I think that anybody that right now wants to predict the future is just, lining up to disappoint people, because we have no idea. What we know is that when God asks the question, can these bones live? That he has the power to bring them back to life. There's this passage in the book of Jeremiah. That's another one of these prophecies of return to exile. You've probably heard it, Jeremiah 29. I'll just read it to you. This is what the Lord says. When 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will come to you and fulfill my good promise to bring you back to this place. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. Then you will call on me and come and pray to me, and I will listen to you. You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart. I will be found by you, declares the Lord, and will bring you back from captivity. I will gather you from all the nations and places where I have banished you, declares the Lord, and I will bring you back to the place from which I carry you into exile. So many sermons, so much ink as we spill talking about this passage, right? Like, we love it, right? Love the plans I have for you, plans to give you hope and a future. And my usual approach to this passage is that people, hey, but read what it says before. Like, they're going to be in exile for 70 years. And it's kind of like just, I grew up in the charismatic world where there's like a lot of sprinkling of like prosperity gospel and faith theology, and it was all like, if you just believe the thing, then God's gonna do it. But I feel like sometimes we can like swing the pendulum too far, and it's like, yes, God promises a future, but there's also the exile, and we have to learn to be faithful and hope in God, and that's true. But listen, sometimes at some point the future becomes the present. And in that story, it was, you're going to exile, and after exile, there's going to be a future. And I don't want to compare what we went through to like being in exile in a foreign land. It's not the same thing at all. But in a way, there is a sort of like that sense that like in the last 16 months, we all went with this collective exile of sorts. As church, as society, as individuals. And the moment of that future when you kind of like come back from that exile, well, it's now. Like as a church, like it's now that we're back to meeting in person. We're seeking to rebuild our ministries and to dream again and to see what God has for us. Well, those promises for the future that God makes the people of Israel, that God make these people, like, well, now is when we need to catch them in. I need him now. Like that future that God talks about, that's the future that I need now. And I wonder if part of what should mark our prayer lives in the next few weeks is claiming those promises. That this is the moment, okay? That we've gone through the exile season, that we've gone through difficulty, that we went through this terribly traumatic, massive thing, and that now that we're about to step on whatever the next thing is, well, that's when we need the hope and the future that God promises. So I want to invite you, we don't usually do this, but I want to close this time leading us in prayer. And leading a prayer asking God for that hope and a future that he promises. That he will bring it to pass in our lives. That God will look at our lives and look at around us and that when he asks, can these bones live, that he will breathe life into them. Do you pray with me? I pray in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. God, we look at your word and look at these stories that you tell about you bringing life into situations of death. About you bringing hope into situations of hopelessness. About you bringing a future into situations that seem like they have no future. And today we come before you as individuals, but also as your people. because we need that now. Not tomorrow, not in a week. Like, we need it now. We need you to breathe life into us now. And there's so many different situations, so many different things that people are going through, so many different challenges that people are going through, God. And yet we believe that if your word is true, if you are who you say you are, then that we can hope and believe that you can do something for us. So Father, today we, as always, just throw ourselves upon your mercy, believing that you're a good God, believing that you don't lie, and believing that you honor your word, and believing then for the hope and the future that you promise, for this renaissance to come in our lives, in our church, and in our society. In the name of your Son, Jesus, we pray. Amen. Hey, thank you guys so much for tuning in. I hope you enjoy the rest of the service. Stay and worship with us, and we'll see you next week. Grace and peace.